Just touch me. Anywhere. One finger. The man who said it weighed 340 pounds. He was standing in the middle of a San Francisco street market in 1969, surrounded by a crowd that had grown to nearly 60 people, and he was pointing at Bruce Lee. Not asking. Daring. The crowd went very quiet. Because the man making the dare was not someone people said no to. Not in that neighborhood. Not anywhere. And Bruce Lee, 140 pounds, 5'7", standing with his hands at his sides like a man waiting for a bus, looked at him for exactly 1 second, then said, "All right." What happened in the 6 seconds after that became the story that nobody could prove and nobody could stop telling. Rewind to the summer of 1969. San Francisco's Chinatown district. Not the tourist version. Not the postcard version with the dragon gates and the lanterns and the carefully curated facade that the city presented to visitors. The real Chinatown. The one behind the one. The narrow streets and the back markets and the particular social ecosystem of a community that had existed in San Francisco for over a century, with its own hierarchies, its own codes, its own version of order that operated independently of the official city around it. Bruce Lee was 30 years old. He was in San Francisco for reasons connected to his growing work in the film world. Meetings, conversations, the early stages of projects that would eventually become the career that made him global. He had connections in the city going back years. He knew people here. He moved through the community not as a celebrity, not yet, but as something the community understood better than celebrity anyway. A fighter of genuine reputation. The kind of man that serious people in serious neighborhoods recognize without needing to be told why. His name, in the street language of that district, was Gao Da Wei. His actual name was David Ko. He was 35 years old, 6 feet 1 inch, 340 pounds. Not the soft weight of inactivity, but the dense, layered weight of a man who had spent years doing physical work and eating to sustain it. He had the build of something geological, wide through the chest and shoulders, thick through the neck, his forearms the size of most men's calves. He had been the informal physical authority of several blocks of that district for nearly a decade. Not a gangster exactly, though he had connections that moved in that direction. More precisely, an enforcer of the particular kind that exists in communities where official law enforcement is not trusted and disputes are settled through other means. He was, in the understanding of the people who lived and worked in that neighborhood, the final answer to questions that started with, "What if someone won't listen?" He had never lost a fight. Not in a ring, not in the street, not in the back corridors of the businesses he protected. Not once. And he had been fighting since he was 14 years old. This is important to understand because the story only makes sense if you understand what David Ko was. He was not a movie villain. He was not a caricature. He was a genuinely dangerous man who had survived genuine danger for 20 years and had the scar tissue, physical and psychological, to prove it. He had looked at every man who had ever stood across from him and made the same calculation. He had always been right. The market was a weekly event, informal, semi-permanent, the kind of gathering that exists in the negative space between official commerce and community life. Stalls selling produce and dried goods and things that didn't have clean categories, the smell of fish and star anise, and the particular density of urban summer air. Bruce Lee had been moving through it with a companion, accounts differ on who, when the situation developed. It began, as these things often do, with something small. A vendor, a disagreement about price or space or some other specific friction that the records don't capture clearly. Bruce Lee's companion was involved, caught in the edge of something that was escalating faster than it should have, the way street situations escalate when the wrong person is paying attention. David Ko was paying attention. He had been watching from perhaps 20 feet away, the way a man who considers a district his territory watches things that happen inside it. He saw the situation, read it the way he always read situations, through the lens of power, of who has it and who doesn't, and where the lines are. He saw Bruce Lee's companion. He saw Bruce Lee, and he made the calculation. He crossed the market in the way that large, physically confident men move through crowds, not aggressively, not running, but with a weight and momentum that caused the space to open ahead of him without him having to ask. People moved. They always moved. He inserted himself into the situation, not to resolve it, to own it, to make clear that whatever was happening here was happening in his space, by his permission.
and that his permission could be withdrawn. He looked at Bruce Lee's companion briefly. Then he looked at Bruce Lee. And what he saw, what he processed in that first assessment, was 140 pounds of lean muscle, standing quietly in a summer shirt. He had made this calculation before. He had made it hundreds of times. He decided the result before the conversation began. He said something dismissive to the companion. A wave of the hand. Not your problem. Go away. The gesture of a man who is reorganizing a situation according to his understanding of its hierarchy. Then he turned to Bruce Lee. And he said something that the witnesses remembered differently, but all agree contained the same core element. You don't want to be here for this. A dismissal. An assessment. A kindness even. Of a particular cold variety. The kindness of a man who has broken things he didn't have to break, and is offering someone an exit before the breaking starts. Bruce Lee looked at him. Not up at him, though the height differential required it. At him. The distinction matters. The looking up carries deference. Looking at carries something else entirely. He said nothing. David Coe had not encountered this before. Not silence. Not in this context. With this body language. From a man who had every reason to find reasons to be somewhere else. He stepped closer. Now the crowd was watching. Now the market had acquired a new center of gravity. People drifting toward this specific intersection of two men without consciously deciding to. The way iron filings drift toward a magnet. Coe said something louder for the audience. The words varied by account, but the structure was consistent. Do you know who I am? Do you understand what I'm telling you? Performing certainty for the crowd. Reminding everyone, including himself, of the established order. Bruce Lee said quietly, I understand what you're telling me. Pause. I'm not going.
The crowd went still. This kind of stillness has a specific texture, not the peaceful stillness of nothing happening, but the compressed stillness of everything held back at once. 60 people holding a collective breath. David Coe looked at Bruce Lee for a long moment, and then he smiled. Not the smile of a man who is amused, the smile of a man who has just reclassified a situation, who has moved a person from one category to another, from not worth the trouble to worth making an example of. He was not angry. That's what several witnesses reported afterward, and that rings true. He wasn't angry because he had no reason to be angry. He had never lost. He had faced larger men than this, more trained men than this, men with reputations that preceded them. He had no framework for what he was about to discover. So he made the dare. He spread his arms slightly, the gesture of a man offering himself as a target, of a man so confident in his own invulnerability that he is willing to give the first move to his opponent as a demonstration of how little it matters. Touch me. Anywhere. One finger. The crowd watched. And Bruce Lee said, All right. Here is what the witnesses describe, not what they expected to describe, not the story they arrived with, what they actually saw, in the moment, in the 6 seconds that followed. Bruce Lee did not prepare. There was no settling into a stance, no visible change in posture, no announcement of what was coming. He was standing, and then he was moving, and the transition between the two states was invisible. Not fast exactly, though it was fast beyond anything the crowd had seen. Invisible in the sense that their eyes, which were watching closely, could not locate the beginning of the motion. He crossed the distance between them. David Coe's arms were still spread, the gesture of openness, of offered target, when Bruce Lee arrived inside them. Inside. Past the reach. Past the point where those enormous arms could generate their power. In the space that Coe had not thought to defend because no one had ever reached it this way before. Contact. Not one place. 3. In a sequence so compressed that witnesses could not separate them into individual events, only a totality, a single complex moment that their eyes parsed as one thing rather than 3. The heel of a palm to the sternum, a forearm check that redirected Coe's instinctive grab, a single precise strike to the nerve cluster at the side of the neck, not a killing blow, not intended to be, intended precisely for what it produced. David Coe sat down. Not fell, not stumbled backward. Sat, the way a man sits when his nervous system has been addressed directly and his legs have received a message that overrides the instruction to stand. He was sitting on the market floor, in the middle of 60 people, looking at nothing in particular.
The duration from Bruce Lee's first movement to Coe's sitting on the ground, witnesses estimated between 5 and 7 seconds. The figure that survived in the telling was 6 seconds. The crowd did not react immediately. This is what always happens. This is the thing that separates genuine physical shock from performed shock. When something happens too fast and too completely for the audience to have a narrative running alongside it, there is a gap, a blank space between the event and the response. The blank space lasted perhaps 3 full seconds. Then someone said something in Cantonese, quietly, to no one. Then several people spoke at once. Then the market erupted, not in cheering, not in the crowd roar of a sporting event, but in the particular sound of 60 people trying to process the same impossible thing simultaneously, the overlapping voices of a community having its understanding revised without warning. Bruce Lee was standing where he had been standing, or rather where he had returned to standing, having completed what he went to do and returned to neutral in the same invisible way he had left it. His expression was unchanged, not triumphant, not cold, simply the same quality of present, level attention that he had carried from the beginning. He looked at Coe, not unkindly, the look of a man who has made a point and is now checking that the point was received without serious damage. Coe was breathing. He was uninjured, beyond the information his nervous system was still processing. His eyes were working. He would be standing again in a minute. Bruce Lee turned, said something quiet to his companion, and walked away through the market, which parted around him in absolute silence. 60 people creating a corridor of space through which he moved, unhurried, back into the city. Nobody stopped him. Nobody said anything. The story moved through Chinatown by nightfall. By the following week, it had reached 3 different cities. By the time it had traveled for a month through the martial arts underground, David Coe's weight in the telling had grown to 500 pounds, and the duration had shrunk to 3 seconds. This is what happens to true stories that are too specific to verify and too vivid to forget. They become myth. But the core, the 60 people in the market, the dare, the 6 seconds, the sitting down, the core remained consistent across every version, because 60 witnesses is a difficult thing to entirely rewrite.
David Coe stood up after 90 seconds. Not immediately, not with the speed of a man who is pretending nothing happened. After 90 seconds, which is, in the compressed time of a public moment, an eternity, his legs found their function again, and he rose from the market floor with the careful deliberateness of a man relearning something he thought he already knew: how to stand. The crowd had not dispersed. This is the detail that matters most about those 90 seconds. 60 people who could have looked away, who could have found reasons to be elsewhere, who could have extended Coe the mercy of an unwitnessed recovery, stayed. They watched him stand. Not with cruelty, with something more complicated than cruelty, the particular attention of a community that has just had its map redrawn and is waiting to understand what the new geography means. Coe looked at the space where Bruce Lee had been. Empty market air, the smell of fish and star anise. He said nothing. He straightened his jacket with both hands, a slow, careful gesture, the physical equivalent of collecting oneself, and walked away through the crowd, which parted for him as it always had. But the parting felt different. The witnesses would describe it differently in the years that followed, but they all described the same thing underneath the different words. The crowd parted, but the reason it parted had changed. Before, it parted because of what Coe represented, the accumulated weight of years and reputation, and the specific kind of fear that a man builds through consistent demonstration. Now, it parted out of something more like consideration. The consideration you extend to someone who has just lost something they didn't know they could lose. He did not appear publicly for 4 days. This was unusual enough that people noticed. David Coe's presence in the district was as regular and predictable as weather. He moved through his territory on a schedule that the neighborhood had absorbed over years, his appearances carrying the particular weight of a man whose absence is itself a statement. For 4 days, the absence said something. The conversations that happened in those 4 days, in the back rooms of the restaurants, in the early morning hours of the markets before the crowds arrived, in the specific locations where serious men in that community spoke seriously, those conversations were the real aftermath of what happened, not the incident itself, the conversations. Because in those conversations, the community was doing what communities do after something disrupts the established order, trying to figure out what it means and what comes next. On the 5th day, Coe returned. He came back the same way he had always come, walking through the district in the morning, stopping at the places he usually stopped, speaking to the people he usually spoke to. But something had changed in the quality of his presence. Not diminished, that is the wrong word. and the people who were there are careful to correct it when accounts get it wrong. He was not diminished. He was quieter. The expansiveness, the particular way he had always occupied more space than his body actually required, the way his confidence had always expressed itself outward into the room around him, that was reduced, pulled back, contained. He had become, in some precise and difficult to articulate way, more accurately sized. And the people in the district, who had lived inside his presence for nearly a decade and knew it the way you know the weather of the city you were born in, noticed. An older merchant who had known Ko since he was young said something about it that was passed around in the neighborhood for years afterward. He said, he came back the right size. Nobody asked him to elaborate. Nobody needed to. What Ko did in those 4 private days is not fully known. What is known, from the single account he gave, years later, to a journalist writing about the martial arts underground of San Francisco in the 1960s and 70s, an account he gave briefly and without drama, and then refused to expand upon, is this. He thought. He said, in that account, I spent 4 days thinking about 6 seconds. I don't know what that says about the 6 seconds. It probably says something about the 4 days. He paused, knowledge. That choice, that's what I spent 4 days thinking about. He didn't say Bruce Lee's name in the account. He didn't need to. Bruce Lee, for his part, said very little about the incident in the immediate aftermath. This was consistent with his nature. He did not collect his confrontations and display them. He did not build his reputation on the telling of stories about himself. The people who knew him well describe a man who was genuinely uninterested in the legend accumulating around him, not falsely modest, not performing humility, but authentically more interested in the next question than in the last answer. He mentioned it once to Dan Inosanto, his student, his close friend, the man who was probably more inside his daily thinking than anyone else during this period. He didn't describe it as a fight, didn't describe it as a confrontation. He described it as a geometry problem. A man that size, he said, creates a particular geometry, the reach, the mass, the way the weight distributes when he commits to movement. Most people look at that geometry and solve for escape. How do I get away from it? I solve for something different. I solve for the one position inside that geometry where all of his advantages become irrelevant. He paused. The way he paused when he was thinking through something rather than performing the having thought through it. There's always a position. In every geometry, there is one place that defeats the geometry from inside it. You don't fight the size, you find the place the size cannot reach. Inosanto, who had heard variations of this principle many times across years of training, said that this was the clearest articulation of it he had ever heard. He wrote it down that evening. The story traveled through the martial arts underground with the particular velocity that true stories achieve when they are also useful. This is the distinction that matters, between stories that travel because they are entertaining, and stories that travel because they carry information that serious people need. The San Francisco market story was both. It was vivid enough to be entertaining, specific enough to carry weight, and embedded with a principle that practitioners recognized and wanted to think about. The principle of interior position. The idea that the correct response to overwhelming force is not to meet it was designed to function inside the reach of larger opponents rather than outside it. Bruce Lee had absorbed this from Ip Man in Hong Kong as a teenager, and had spent his adult life extracting the pure principle from the specific technique. What the market encounter illustrated was the principle at its most naked. No forms, no sequences, no techniques drawn from a stylistic tradition. Just the geometry, solved in real time, in 6 seconds, against 340 pounds of genuine danger. The people who heard the story and understood it, the serious practitioners, the coaches and competitors who were doing the honest work of thinking about what actually functions under pressure, heard something in it that changed how they thought about the problem of size. Not that size doesn't matter. Size matters enormously. But size, like any structure, has its own interior, its own negative space. The place where its advantages invert. Find the interior. That's the whole lesson. That was the lesson Bruce Lee had been teaching in different forms for years, and the market in Chinatown had demonstrated it in the most direct possible language.
6 months after the market incident, Bruce Lee was in Hong Kong. The film work had accelerated. The trajectory that would end in Enter the Dragon and global recognition was building itself out of smaller moments, the way large things always build, through accumulation, through the private, sustained effort that precedes the public arrival. He was training differently in this period. Everyone close to him noticed it. Not a different discipline. The principles of Jeet Kune Do were established, the philosophy was set. But a different quality of attention in his training, a narrowing, a reduction. He had always been moving toward essence, toward the stripped-down, irreducible core of what worked and why. But in the months following San Francisco, the movement toward essence seemed to accelerate. He trained alone more, thought on paper more. The notebooks from this period are dense, diagrams and principles and questions that circle the same territory from different angles, looking for the view that reveals something the other views have hidden. One of the entries from late 1969 reads, in the translation that his wife Linda later provided from his private notes, something like, "The opponent's size is not the obstacle. The opponent's size is the information. What does this size require? What does it need to function? Find what it needs and arrive there first, not to attack, to simply be there, in the place the size requires. Make the size solve a problem it was never built to solve." This was the philosophy of the market, written in the private language of a man who never stopped interrogating his own understanding. Make the size solve a problem it was never built to solve. He underlined it twice. There is something that needs to be said about Bruce Lee in 1969 that his mythology sometimes obscures. He was in pain. His back injury, the result of a training accident earlier that year, a damaged sacral nerve caused by improper weight training, was serious enough that his doctors told him he might never practice martial arts at full capacity again. He spent months in bed. He spent months reading and writing because he could not train. And what he produced in those months of forced stillness, the notes, the philosophy, the articulation of principles that had previously existed in his body rather than on paper, became the foundation of the written legacy that outlasted him. The pain produced the clarity. This is the part of the story that the market incident connects to in ways that aren't obvious but matter. 6 months after demonstrating against 340 pounds in a Chinatown market, Bruce Lee was lying on his back, unable to move, and writing about the same principles in a different form. The geometry of large forces and the interior positions that defeat them. The place you find when you cannot rely on the body's conventional strengths. The response that operates below the level of size and speed, at the level of understanding. He was not writing about martial arts. He was writing about how to be alive inside conditions that are trying to reduce you. The market story reached David Coe's ears in its traveled, expanded, legendary form about 8 months after it happened. He heard a version in which he weighed 500 pounds. He heard a version in which Bruce Lee had not touched him but had simply looked at him and he had sat down. He heard a version in which 40 men had witnessed it. He heard a version in which Bruce Lee had said something afterward that became the moral of the story. Something wise and cinematic that Bruce Lee had never actually said. Coe, by all accounts, found these versions more amusing than anything else. He had been there. He knew the actual dimensions of it. The market, the 60 people, the 6 seconds, the specific feeling of his legs receiving a message that overrode their intention to stand. He had no investment in the legend growing larger than the truth. Because the truth, as he had spent 4 days learning, was already larger than he had known how to hold. He said this to the journalist who later interviewed him. The stories make it bigger. But the thing itself was already big enough. I don't need it to be 500 pounds. 340 was plenty. In 1971, Bruce Lee gave an interview, one of the famous ones, the ones that scholars and practitioners and people who were trying to understand him still return decades later. He was asked about size, about whether a smaller man could genuinely defeat a larger one, or whether that was a mythology created by the martial arts world to make itself feel significant. He answered in the way he always answered the questions that mattered, not with the performance of wisdom, but with the actual working through of a principle. He said something like, "You're asking the wrong question. You're asking whether small can be large. The question is whether understanding can be assumption. The large man assumes his size is the conversation. The understanding man knows it isn't. When you understand something that the other person is only assuming, you have already won a kind of victory that the physical conclusion is just the expression of." He paused. The body executes what the mind has already resolved. By the time I move, the question is already answered. The movement is just the announcement. The journalist wrote it down. Then asked, "Has this been tested? In real situations, not demonstrations?" Bruce Lee looked at him for a moment. Then said, "Yes." And did not elaborate. David Coe retired from the informal enforcement work in 1972. He opened a small business, something legitimate, the kind of pentant that men in his position sometimes make when the calculation of what they're trading changes. He remained in the district, remained a presence, not the physical authority he had been, but a different kind of presence, the kind that comes from having seen something and changed because of it. He lived into his 70s. The journalist who interviewed him toward the end of his life asked him directly, "Do you think about it?" Coe was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I think about what I didn't know. Not about him, about me. I didn't know there was a gap between how strong I was and how much I understood. I thought they were the same thing. That was my mistake." He looked at his hands, the large, scarred hands of a man who had spent decades using them. Turns out they're not even close to the same thing.
Bruce Lee died in July 1973. He was 32 years old. Weeks before Enter the Dragon showed the world what those of us paying attention had already seen. Weeks before the name became the legend and the legend became the permanent fact of the 20th century. What remained was the work. The films, the philosophy, the notebooks full of underlined principles. The stories, some documented, some not, some documented partially, all of them containing, at their core, the same thing. A man who had decided, very early, to solve the problem of existence at a level beneath the obvious variables. Not bigger, not stronger, not faster, except as a byproduct. Deeper. He had gone deeper into the question of what fighting was than anyone before him had gone. Deeper into the question of what the body could understand. Deeper into the gap between assumption and knowledge. That gap he had identified in Chinatown, in Long Beach, in every private gym and public demonstration of his life. The gap between assuming you understand something and actually understanding it. He lived in that gap. He trained in it. He built his entire philosophy inside it. And in a San Francisco market in 1969, in 6 seconds, against 340 pounds of genuine danger, he demonstrated it one more time. Not for the crowd, not for the legend, for the same reason he did everything. Because the principle was real, and real things deserved to be expressed completely. Whatever weight is standing across from you right now, whatever version of 340 pounds your life has placed in your path, the principle holds. You are not looking for a way around it. You are not looking for a way through it. You are looking for the interior. The place inside the problem where the problem's own structure works against itself. The position that the weight was never built to defend because it never imagined anything could reach it. That position exists in every geometry, in every opposition, in every moment where size is being used as the final argument. The final argument was never size. It was never strength. It was never reach. It was always, underneath everything, beneath every layer of assumption and tradition and the accumulated weight of what everyone agrees is true. Understanding. Understand what others only assume. Move from knowledge while they move from habit. Arrive in the interior before they remember to defend it. 6 seconds, or less. If this story landed somewhere real, subscribe, because every week we bring back the buried moments, the market stories, and the backroom demonstrations, and the 6-second lessons that history filed under legend because it didn't know what else to do with them. The stories that prove, again, that the most dangerous thing any human being can possess is not mass. It is clarity.